folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back. My name is Kat. I'm a licensed and registered dietitian nutritionist, and on this channel we like to talk about weight neutral focused approaches to health, as well as dive into, in my opinion, what is scammy and unethical nutrition related products, businesses, companies, and other fear mongering nutrition related claims. Today's video is a discussion about Gwen Shamblin, and specifically talking about the HBO documentary The Way Down, which that title is a play on her weight loss program, also called The Way Down, of course spelled differently. This is an opinion video, so before you come to your own conclusions, I encourage you to do your own information gathering. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Before we jump in, I want to share that Gwen's church, Remnant Church, has created a page on their website. I will leave linked down below. For legal purposes, I want to read a few statements made by them, including Remnant Fellowship categorically denies the absurd, defamatory statements and accusations made in this documentary, yet another Hollywood attack on religion. Over the last 20 years, countless celebrities and public figures have had to endure allegations of child abuse, eating disorders, sexual abuse, and more. While many of these situations might be accurate, they are definitely situations where people are falsely accused. In today's society, everybody should be highly discerning regarding anything they see on any media. We insist that the allegations made against our church are completely false and defamatory. Our Christian beliefs are Bible-based. Our church is a place based on love, care, mercy, and kindness shown to people from all walks of life. We have helped thousands to find a relationship with God. Remnant Fellowship vehemently denies any accusation of child abuse in any form. Regarding HBO's expert testimony, their expert never visited the church, never spoke with Gwen, and never talked with any current members. HBO originally interviewed cult expert Dr. Gordon Melton, who cleared Remnant Fellowship's name of having anything to do with being a cult. We do not body shame or bully anyone, as we know that God created all of us uniquely with different sizes, shapes, and weights. We also do not approach anyone about weight, but we have helped those who approach us wanting help. Otis Rickman, a pulmonary and critical care physician who attends Remnant, sums this up well. Everybody's different. God made us all different. We have big, sturdy, muscular. We have thin, wispy people. We have all kinds of people. As any other church, Remnant Fellowship operates under all U.S. guidelines and laws. And Elizabeth, daughter of Gwen, says, in every action, deed, and word, my mother lived for God alone. No matter what false accusations came her way, she was kind, loving, and gentle. She never turned away from anyone in need. She donated much of her time, energy, and personal finances to the building and grounds of Remnant Fellowship. And Michael and I were fully behind those decisions. There are a couple of other statements that they made on this webpage that aren't really related to what we talk about in this video, and more of other things that are covered in the documentary. And there are other testimonies on topics covered in the documentary also left on the webpage. So for legal purposes, I just wanted to share their official response to the HBO Max documentary. And this video is just for free comment and critique and opinion based. Okay, so I have a lot to say before we jump in. I heard about Gwen for the first time by Fundie Fridays this past summer. I had never heard of her or her program ever before. I love Fundie Fridays. I will go ahead and leave the specific videos where she goes over, where she talks about Gwen, and she really takes it from more of a cult religion kind of aspect look at it, which I found fascinating. But I will be taking more of a look at the nutrition aspects of everything. So I did hear about her for the first time actually after she passed away. She was involved in a small plane crash that included her husband and some other members from the church, her own church. And at that time, I was just surprised that I had never heard of her, especially because it was mentioned that she was a dietitian, and I was looking up some other information on her, and it just kept coming up that she was a dietitian. And so I was even more surprised that I'd never heard of her before, because there's so many dietitians in the world and in the country, but it's still kind of small. You still know of, especially if you have dietitians who are doing like big programs like her Way Down program was. It's kind of a small world in dietetics. Even in our resource groups, like with the Academy of Nutrition Dietetics, like you get to know people. And then even with a lot of dietitian Facebook groups, like you also get to know a lot of the people. And so even though there's a lot of dietitians out there, it's still kind of a community, like you know who's out there, especially like if they're doing programs like this. And so the fact that I had never heard of her before was really surprising to me, and the fact that she ran kind of what some people call like this diet cult was just fascinating. So I wanted to do a video on her, but I didn't know how appropriate that was, seeing as she had just passed away. But with this HBO Max documentary, I did have quite a few people reach out to me and ask me to do a reaction or review on it, and so that's what I'm doing today. The other reason why I was surprised that I hadn't heard from her is that her programs were actually used in a lot of churches, like throughout the 90s. And so I was surprised that being around the Christian church, I had never seen any church use any of her programs. Maybe I was oblivious to that, but I just didn't. And it's really interesting because I grew up with a kind of conservative household, but the more that I learn about how other people grew up in the church, the more I seem to have had a much more like liberal leaning on just the household and how I grew up. It was very chill. I was never forced to go to church. Like I remember sometimes I would be like, I'm tired, or I don't want to go. And my parents would be like, okay, we'll see you later. Go to sleep. I know my parents had good friends who were part of the LGBT community. They were chill. I've also have been finding out that like a lot of people who grew up in the church weren't allowed to like listen to popular music. But in my case, half of my room was plastered with posters of people like Hilary Duff, Jesse McCartney, Aaron Carter, and more. And then the other half of my room was filled with Harry Potter merch, which a lot of people who grew up in the church weren't allowed to read the books or watch the movies. By the way, this was before I learned that J.K. Rowling was a huge TERF, and I no longer support purchasing any merchandise and having her benefit from it because yikes. But overall, it was a very chill childhood in regards, in like overall, but especially in regards to growing up in the church. So I don't really see myself or my experience whenever I see some people talking about the very real and like toxic things that they experienced within the church. And maybe I was oblivious to everything, but when it comes to like my faith, my whole life has really just been focused on reading about and learning about trying to be like Jesus. And really nothing about the different kind of rules from different denominations and everything. Like just looking at the cross and loving people like Jesus, that sums it up. I see that and how it directly relates to social justice work, caring for the poor and oppressed. And unfortunately, that's not what I see from some people who identify being in the church. And I just feel like a lot of times people can take things kind of like cherry pick out of context and make it into something hateful. And I'm not here for that, especially when I look at the history of how it's been used to really harm people. Even in my own field and what I have talked about in other videos when it comes specifically to dieting and these kind of body ideals and how it really, a lot of really messed up things when it comes to body ideals and just kind of fat phobia in general, how that stems from people like that. So I just wanted to say that up front, and so you can kind of see where my perspective is coming from. I won't really be hitting on the religion side. I will be focusing more so on the nutrition aspects, but some of that other stuff kind of comes into play naturally because we are talking about a diet, what some people call diet cults. Allegedly, because talking about diets and nutrition is just something that we do on this channel. So HBO, in my opinion, did a great job on this documentary. It really lined up with a lot of what Fundie Fridays mentioned in her multiple videos on Gwen Shamblin and just her whole church. So according to the documentary, Gwen Shamblin Laura lived in Brentwood, Tennessee, which I found is the second wealthiest place in Tennessee, located just south of Nashville. Her church, Remnant Fellowship, has an estimated 2,000 members, according to the documentary, and also uses Ashland Plantation, which serves as a Remnant event center for things like weddings, which I can't imagine getting married or having any kind of event at a place like a plantation with what its history would be. But based on where the church is located and everything, that really doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. It's mentioned by somebody in the documentary that this church has this kind of like fake persona. Sounds like toxic positivity, which again doesn't really surprise me. So the documentary kind of opens up with a clip or recording of Gwen talking about the state of the church and weight loss and how it is connected. It also talks about her history and her growing up in the church, and also about her relationship with food, which was heavily impacted by her mother, and her mother being part of the Clean the Plate Club, basically where you're encouraged to whatever you put on your plate, like eat it fully, regardless of where your fullness levels were. It then talks about how she went to college and decided to major in nutrition. So this is the part that got me really confused, because she went the route of what you need to do in order to become a registered dietitian, but she never actually mentions being a dietitian that I could find. And in another video I found where she kind of talked about the same background but didn't mention being a dietitian. So I'm just kind of curious, this is just like my own curiosity. I'm wondering if, because she had the prerequisites, I wonder if she did apply to her dietetic internship, or kind of like what we would call like a residency. I just can't imagine her like going through that process and not kind of finishing it out to become a dietitian. And I know some people change their mind and they don't do that, but based on what she continued to do, it would make sense of her to go ahead and finish that route out. Okay, so I did want to update that I was able to find that on her In Memory Of website. It says she was a dietitian, but it's odd because dietitians don't spell it like that. I know in some countries it will be spelled with a C, but in America where she resided, it's with a T. So I just think it's a little bit odd that if she had physical certificates or licensure cards, something, that it would be listed with a T, and why someone would write that wrong on her website. That's all I could find though, so I guess we're just gonna go with that and say that she was a registered dietitian based on her website. So she went to school and she majored in nutrition and dietetics, and then used that knowledge paired together with what she had learned with her experience kind of growing up, and then also kind of running to food apparently when she was in college, and she then created this kind of Bible study diet. Now, her approaches to dieting was basically just portion control, and it was based around whenever your stomach was growling, and then eating until you were satisfied. And in addition to that, also praying away your hunger when you weren't experiencing that stomach growling, instead of just eating. And apparently to only think about food whenever you were hungry. As the member mentioned, this was the time when you were right with God. So how she packaged that and sold that to so many people makes a whole lot of sense when you think about what she was selling and what her position was. She was playing into one of the areas where many people have lots of insecurities, so around body image and wanting to diet to change their body. And she was selling that to people who already really trusted her because they saw her as like a community figure or like another believer. So they had that kind of trust in her. They trusted her to help them get closer to God, as well as help them to lose weight. Those were huge areas of importance to those people's lives. And so it makes sense why, I think it makes like complete sense how something like that could really take hold in not just her church, but churches overall. Gwen's weight loss plan was apparently God's way of helping people to lose weight, and the Way Down workshops began to be preached essentially as an answer to the world's evils. So you might be wondering, what is so wrong about this? Besides what is interesting about the whole idea of praying away your hunger, we know that there's nothing inherently wrong with eating when your stomach is growling and eating until you are satisfied. In diets though, diet culture in general, the whole waiting to eat until you are hungry can become a diet in itself, causing guilt and shame if somebody eats outside of their stomach growling, even if they are hungry. I mean, sometimes we need to eat based on the context without having our stomach growling. An example might be if you know you have, let's say, 5 or 6 hours of like meetings or just different errands, and you know you won't be able to eat, even if you're not really hungry or you're not having stomach growling before that, but you know you won't be able to eat for that amount of time. It might be smart to go ahead and have something to eat during that time so that you can be nourished and have energy throughout that time. And so you won't get to a place where you are very, very hungry. Or let's say you're going on a long run. Let's say you're going for a 5-mile or 10-mile run. I work with a lot of athletes. And so sometimes they might not be hungry at the beginning of their run, but they still need to eat something in order so that they don't crash later. Or even besides that context, like, you are still allowed to enjoy food and eat food if your stomach's not growling. Like, even when we start to feel those more subtle signs of hunger, but even outside of that, it is okay. You don't have to have this kind of guilt or shame for eating outside of that hunger. And so I've heard some kind of people say that it seems like she had kind of more of an intuitive eating approach, when really that's not intuitive eating. Again, if you haven't checked out my video on what intuitive eating is, I'll leave it linked up in the cards. But intuitive eating has a framework, it has principles, and it is not just about eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full. It is way more than that. And so where that comes into play is that several times I have been reading about and kind of gathering information about Gwen's program, and even hearing her say that it's not a diet, when if you want to make a diet, like, that is okay. If you want to go on a diet, I can't stop you, and I'm not going to shame or guilt anybody about that, but at least call it for what it is. And I have just a really big frustration or pet peeve, I guess, of people saying that something is not a diet when it is a diet. That might just be me, but that was something that I did want to mention. So let's take a little dive into history and talk about how a diet cult, not saying this one is, don't sue me at Remnant Church, but let's talk about how a diet cult can really easily come into play, especially with dieting history. If you've watched my Health at Every Size video, then you might remember more of the history of dieting. But if you haven't watched that, or if you need a reminder, let's go ahead and do a brief overview. So when we look at the literature, we see that larger and fleshier physiques were more desired in the Renaissance age, or the Renaissance time. By the turn of the 17th century, though, things started to shift. In England, thinness was taking off as being desired in men, as fatness to them signaled a sign of lack of self-control. Slenderness or thinness kind of became this proof for having rationale and being an intelligent thinker and having that kind of self-control. And there began to become this kind of stereotype for Africans around that time to have had freely gratifying their animal appetites, and so they didn't have that kind of, according to them, that self-control, and so they had larger bodies. There are books from around that time linking this kind of slow-wittedness with overindulgence from people of color. Moving into the early Enlightenment, the height of beauty that they suggested should reflect the nation's morality around their own kind of temperance, as well as its racial caliber. Anything that could be construed as evidence for gluttony, they thought was beneath them. There was also this kind of push for women to scrub their diets of any kind of food excess or unholy excess. And if they had to fast or purge in order to transform their body for a temple for the Lord, so be it. There was this kind of teaching on how to behave before the eyes of the Lord, and a central theme around that was one's own self-control around eating and drinking. So you have this kind of push towards a smaller body for religious purposes, and it just kind of continued. You have this kind of foundation for this ideal body type coming from religion, and that being tied to very racially motivated factors for that thinness. And that just kind of continued on. And so we still are seeing the results from that. And it's really gross, in my opinion, and very harmful. But it makes complete sense why something like that would really thrive in this kind of church. In my opinion, I can't imagine Jesus like fat shaming someone or saying that like anybody else's body is like beneath them. That just seems so ridiculous. Like, I just get really frustrated about that, and seeing all the effects and the impacts and like the result of that kind of history and how it is turned into just so much fat phobia in today's world is just one of the most upsetting things to me. And it's probably because I see it on a daily basis. I work in this field, but it is when you go down the history, and if you want more history, then definitely check out my Health at Every Size video linked up in the cards. But the more that I learn about the history of dieting and just these kind of body ideals, just the more hate that I see coming from other people and how they just manipulated so many people into thinking this way. So Gwen's programs all started out good and all, not in my words, but apparently because a lot of different churches were using her programs, but she did end up starting to get into some controversy because of some of the things that she was preaching. She apparently began to preach some major red flags for a lot of believers, including denying the Holy Trinity. She also began preaching about how her church was the only truth. Basically, it feels like this is where it began to be less about more traditional teachings and more of Gwen and her diet under her authority. So a lot of different churches began sending back their programs of Gwen's, what they had purchased, and it really seems like that's when her own church really started to grow and become kind of that close-knit community. So the diet information was mostly in episode 1, but it does come up in the other 2 here and there. In episode 2, it was really interesting. There was a really sad part where it talked about how she lost her grandchild. Her grandchild ended up passing away. But it really showed how toxic the church was, in my opinion. So basically, her grandchild passed away, and because they subscribed to what I would call a very non-biblical point of view, they saw that as God judging them, judging the church. And so it just kind of seems like she was preaching this kind of prosperity gospel, which has so much privilege weaved into it. From just kind of the clips that I saw, those were kind of the vibes that I was getting from this, which again isn't surprising. I just always get upset at people who think that because someone else is going through something really hard or challenging or really sad, that it means that they're being judged. It just seems very Westboro Baptist Church to me. I also thought it was really interesting, and by interesting I mean like no words, but not surprising that they kind of see weight on the same level of like somebody experiencing depression and other things.
It's time for people our age to quit. Don't be like everybody else. Why are you trying to just join the crowd of rebellious kids? they're going to be nowhere, and in 5 years, they're going to be depressed, overweight, their marriages are going to fall apart. If they even get married, they're going to get divorced. All these horrible things are happening right now, and it's just getting worse. So you've got to start over. We're starting a new trend, and that trend is obedience.
Body size doesn't have to mean those things. And a lot of people at a lower weight can also experience those things. There's just a whole lot of fat shaming going on here. I mean, are we surprised? No. It seemed like Gwen was using her program and her members' weights as a way of showing how, like, holy the whole community was. I mean, this is an example of what we see in the history that I had mentioned earlier, how it is seen, how somebody's weight and their body is seen as this kind of holiness, like a level of holiness. It's this kind of thought of seeing somebody's body as kind of how holy they are, which has a lot to do with genetics. And so there are going to be people who are doing this program who are going to have better results than others. And when even you're talking about the results, we always talk about this on this channel, but when we're looking at different kind of dieting programs, but it doesn't matter if something, in my opinion, it doesn't matter if something like works while you're doing the program. What is the sustainability aspect of that? Like, do you want to continue doing that your whole life? And if you stop doing that, are you going to go back to where you were before because it was something that wasn't sustainable? Now, I also thought it was wild, and I should have expected this. I didn't even think about it, but they do have, according to the documentary, a homeschool curriculum. Now, I'm not against homeschooling. I was homeschooled from 3rd grade up until college. It allowed me to do a lot of really fun things, like continue with my training in figure skating during the school hours, and then also to have really flexibility in working when I was working with Radio Disney and being a kid correspondent and doing like movie reviews and radio commercials, things like that. So I had a really fun time being homeschooled, but I feel like some families can just kind of indoctrinate their kids and keep them from having outside influence, learning about other kinds of people, and at that same time kind of let their actual schooling suffer. So I definitely can support homeschooling if it is done in a very healthy way and you're actually learning, but I think in the wrong hands it can be very dangerous. And because of this clip that I will share, I am concerned that this curriculum was leaning more so on that side of maybe not giving them the most amount of education that they could actually use in the real world.
The way you show God that you are answering to Him is through obeying your mother and your father on the first time. If you obey the second and the third time, or if you are slow to obey, you are being your own God. And nobody playing around like that can ever go to heaven. So you will only live for a few years on earth, and then you will have a horrible afterlife. If you do not obey mommy and daddy the first time, you will be taken out, and you will be very, very sorry.
Why do we need to terrorize kids into obedience? I don't support that. It just doesn't seem very loving. If somebody were to ever say anything like that to my child, I would immediately leave, because that is, in my opinion, just toxic and not loving. And the fact that some of the members were okay with physical punishment, even if it was with a glue stick, I feel so bad for the kids, and I just hope that they can get the appropriate care whenever they can get away. Even having my child being spoken to, like Gwen was speaking to those kids and like terrorizing them into obedience, like I would rather have my child not obey than to be terrified that they're gonna have a short life and like go to hell for not listening to me. Saying that to a child, in my opinion, or even to an adult, but saying that especially to a child, in my opinion, that is straight up mental abuse. So I just wanted to touch on that homeschooling aspect because of my history being homeschooled. It's just not one that I would really consider. There are so many other homeschool resources out there that allow you to make sure that the kid is getting the appropriate schooling and isn't gonna like terrorize them into that kind of obedience. I also wanted to share this experience from someone who did Gwen's program that I have found. I did receive her permission to share this anonymously. Again, for legal purposes, I'm not going into this saying and declaring that this is a cult. I'm giving a review of the documentary that calls it a cult, as well as sharing this person's experience who also calls it a cult. Again, please do your own information gathering before coming to your own conclusions. So she says, I binged this documentary last night. Yes, the cult of Gwen Shamblin is real. I saw it firsthand. 1997 to 2000, we were part of her weight loss Bible study Way Down workshop. We went to the yearly conferences. We went to small workshops around the states. We were invested. I lost weight. Because I lost weight, I was asked to share my testimony. One of the many conferences I went to, Gwen was also a speaker. As the speaker team got ready, I got to meet Gwen. When the doors opened, people rushed into her. She was a superstar. It was bizarre to me the way people treated her, almost like she was a goddess. When I shared my testimony, I said, run to God as hard as you ran to Gwen. Like, hello people, she is just a person. At dinner that night, I sat next to Gwen. She reprimanded me, saying people should follow her the way they followed Paul's example in the Bible. That was such a weird reaction and my first red flag. Later that year, we went to actually visit her church, Remnant Fellowship. The people were so friendly. There was so much joy and connection. But after the service, Gwen commanded me to go talk to a single guy for the purpose of dating. It was so weird, and we never went back. We could see Gwen was the leader, the one everyone sought to know what to do. She had control over everyone, way too many red flags. So it's weird here, 20 plus years, to watch this documentary on the cult of Gwen Shamblin. As I watched, it's easy to wonder how people get sucked into cults, but don't be too quick to judge. Organizations that require blind obedience are plentiful, and many people allow others to have control over aspects of their life that, looking in from the outside, seem bizarre. There are other organizations that allow sinful humans to have an elevated position and appear to think these leaders have some special revelation from God, which then require total obedience to their commands and no questions allowed. You know it's a cult if, when you leave, you're shunned and shamed. You know it's a cult if they think they're the only ones going to heaven or they are the only true group of believers. You know it's a cult if blind obedience to a human is required. You know it's a cult if you're not allowed to question or doubt the leadership. You know it's a cult if people need the leadership's permission to see family, spend money, make medical decisions, and conform to everyone else. Don't be so quick to judge those sucked into cults. They provide community and stability many folks are longing for. Cults are plentiful these days. Power-hungry folks are very willing to control others. Greedy people are willing to take your money with the promise of some spiritual awakening or awareness. Sinful people are satisfied when they create a culture where you're not allowed to question them or critique them. Pay attention and you will see cult-like organizations everywhere. Don't fall for flashy talkers who steal your independence while promising you the world, yet never give you what they promise. Don't fall for cult-like leaders who promise you some inside scoop or elevated knowledge of God, while really just alienating you from free thinking. I do recommend this documentary. It's eye-opening. I do think this person made a really good point as to not be so quick to judge those sucked into a cult, that they provide a community and stability that many folks are longing for. And if you've been around my channel before, you know that I mostly, when I'm talking about unethical nutrition related programs and such, they're mostly related to nutrition MLMs. And we can see how those often provide a very much needed community and stability that folks are longing for. So I just wanted to point that out, that is something that a lot of creators, anti-MLM creators, have spoken about in regards to MLMs in general and the community that many people are longing for that it provides. So overall, based on this program and the amounts of guilt and shame that it appears to support, I would not feel comfortable recommending this program to somebody who I wanted to recommend something to help them have good nourishment and a healthy relationship with food. I get a lot of sketchy vibes from this, and it just feels like something that I would expect to be seen coming from a diet cult. Again, not saying this is a diet cult. Now, I did find this used copy of Gwen's The Way Down Diet. I did want to do a full review on it, but I just did not have time for it. I will be headed into maternity leave at the end of October, which is like now. So I might get a chance to read it, but I'm not 100% sure that I can commit to it. But let me know if you would like for me to read that. I think she has another book as well. All right, well, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and make sure you're subscribed. I would really appreciate that. Of course, only if you want. And remember, you can strive for health without subscribing to diet culture or by joining a diet cult. I'll see you later.